Welcome back to the second part of this conversation on how St. Augustine and Luther would vote in 2024. In the first part of this conversation, we cover the biblical background, specifically the New Testament background on politics and government, before diving into St. Augustine's political theory, which is most notably seen in his work, The City of God. That conversation is really led by Bruce Hillman. And then today we are diving specifically into Martin Luther's doctrine or theory of two kingdoms, which is how he is known, the place that people go to read Luther's thoughts on politics and government. I'm back in this conversation with Bruce Hillman and Adam Francisco. With that, enjoy today's show. I feel like Luther has some similar things to say, but obviously I know that already we've pointed out a few distinctions. So Adam, if you could start maybe by laying out, I don't know if you want to start with, probably two kingdoms is where I thought we would go. You tell me, but broadly for people, two kingdoms, sometimes it's called a doctrine, sometimes it's called a theory. It seems to be where it seems to come up often when Luther's talking about politics, or that's when people talk about what Luther had to say about politics, they usually are referring to two kingdoms. But as we've talked a lot about at this point, that has been used in a lot of ways by a lot of people from various political leanings. Because Luther is more of an occasional theologian, he's not necessarily creating like this systematic structure when he pulls that out. And so it is kind of a complicated theory or doctrine to understand. With that in mind, can you kind of walk us through what it is broadly, if you could just give if there is a way to give like a general definition for it?
Well, you already hinted at this. So the doctrine of Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms is it's both simple and extremely complicated, because in Luther's own writings, there's like a labyrinth of sub-doctrines and manifests itself because he's an occasional theologian, meaning he's speaking to particular occasions. You're going to run into, if you just look at it as a sort of theoretical construct, a political theory, which Luther is no political theorist, you're going to run into what look like contradictions. Add to that, like with Augustinian studies, a history of interpretation of Luther and writing on what the two kingdoms doctrine is, that's been heavily, I would argue, influenced by Enlightenment ideas. And this, the real simple reference would be to this idea that there's a wall of separation, Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation between the two kingdoms, or the church and the state, that James Madison can credit Luther for coming up with that sort of notion. Luther can't even conceive of things that way. So it's easy to see in Luther modern sort of political motifs if you're just looking at the words and in the surface level, but it is quite complicated, and there's still a lot of debates out there among Luther scholars that are really unresolved. For example, you would think, in looking at a cursory look at Luther's two kingdom doctrine, where for Luther, God rules over the world in two particular ways. In his right-handed kingdom, which is a spiritual kingdom, which is directed towards eternity or towards salvation, it manifests itself exclusively when his word is preached by preachers, and in the administration of the sacraments. When forgiveness is given, that's where you get the right-hand kingdom manifesting itself. It is not synonymous with the church, the institutional church. And then you have everything else, the left-handed temporal or worldly kingdom, where things are ordered towards penultimate ends, but quite different, I would argue, different than Augustine. And the two kingdoms doctrine, anybody who teaches it I don't know if it's anybody, but every time I've heard it taught, the person teaching it or lecturing on it always makes the point that while Luther was of the Augustinian order, and Luther drank deeply from the well of Augustine's theology, his two kingdom doctrine is not Augustine's two cities. For Luther, the left-handed kingdom, the temporal realm, is actually quite important. But he will make a very sharp distinction for example, there's a lot of places where you could go to in Luther's writings and get a taste of this, but some of the earliest works are his untemporal. It's usually translated untemporal authority or unworldly authority. That's, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, 1523. He's got another essay where he's addressing the question of whether or not Christians can be soldiers too, called On Whether a Soldier Too Can Be Saved. There's a little reference, I guess little is accurate, to Two Kingdoms doctrine and his famous bondage of the will. And then you find it manifested in all sorts of occasional writings on marriage and what to do with the issue of the Ottoman Turks coming into Central Europe, the question of how to handle Jewish rabbis blaspheming Christ in their liturgies and so on and so forth. So, but God rules over the world in two ways. One is directed towards eternal ends and brings this alien righteousness through the preaching and the administration of the sacraments to citizens of the right-hand kingdom, of which only the elect are members. And by elect, we're, like Bruce said with Augustine, don't think of that in Calvinistic terms, but just
right.
whoever has been given the gift of faith.
Yeah.
Everybody else, everybody is also, only the elect are citizens in that kingdom, but everybody is a citizen of the temporal kingdom. And across the globe, though Luther doesn't know what's going on on the other side of the planet or anything like that, there are all sorts of kingdoms or regimes, and not one of them is better than the other. Maybe Augustine would say something like that. But all of them in some way are divine things. That is, God has, following with Romans 13, that God has built into the created order, the necessity after the fall for worldly government, actual regimes. And Christians have you can't escape it, but also ought to embrace citizenship in that kingdom, not in an ultimate way, but in a way that's best informed by his doctrine of vocation. Because while in the right-handed kingdom, righteousness before God is given through faith, in the temporal kingdom, the horizontal realm, human beings, Christians included, are to pursue a active type of righteousness. That is not in any way a saving righteousness, but are to pursue, if you will, virtue. They're to pursue what's good and true, and not for their own sake, but for the sake of their neighbor. So that can mean, for Luther to talk about like specifics, he's a strong proponent of what we today would call the nuclear family, and that the state in many ways, in Luther's thinking, comes from the family. As the human family grows, governments become kind of necessary, but the government above families is not there to direct families, but rather to serve the families living within their jurisdiction, if you will. At the same time, Luther can, when he's asked, or what to do when families fall apart in instances of like adultery or something, Luther can give pretty strong, and it'll take you aback a bit, in that he'll recommend the death penalty for adulterers. So in another example, in light of the two kingdom doctrine, you would maybe think, and a lot of people think that means there is this wall of separation between church and state, that the church shouldn't speak into the into the temporal or secular arena and vice versa. But when Luther's asked whether or not other theological opinions could be publicly asserted, whether or not there should be blasphemy laws, he's very much in favor of laws against blasphemy. So, like Augustine,
Interesting.
I think with Augustine and Augustinian studies, there's enough in Luther's writings that you could certainly interpret him a different way. But another curious thing with Luther is he doesn't change his mind radically over the years, but there's been a lot of focus on the early Luther. And who doesn't like the two kingdom doctrine if you read Luther? It sounds like a nice kind of handy way of thinking about the world. But when you get into his more mature thinking, you realize that his two kingdom doctrine is not this sort of like a 16th century version of the separation of church and state and First Amendment kind of stuff and things like that. Although I mentioned earlier, James Madison credits Luther with the guy who comes up with this notion. So it's a complicated mess. That's all I should have said.
Well, I wonder if it would be helpful if you talk a little bit about, and I maybe should have started with this question, the political backdrop that Luther found himself in,
yeah.
because that might help clarify for people what you mean when Luther specifically is talking about the church, laws against blaspheming, or how that mix plays out in a right-hand kingdom way, or sorry,
Yes.
left-hand kingdom way.
Luther. So there's a big debate among Luther scholars that goes back some time on whether or not Luther is a early modern or a late medieval figure. And I would situate him as, I'd suggest he's very much a late medieval figure. That is to say, if you're wanting to understand his theology and his ideas, you got to understand it in light of this medieval context. So in the Middle Ages, there's a lot of centuries there. So it would be really hard to summarize what's going on over the course of 1,000 years in just a few minutes. But in general, there's this long debate that goes way back to, let's say, with Constantine, the assertion of what's sometimes called the two-sword theory on what should take priority in terms of leadership. Should it be the state, the king or the emperor, or should it be the pope? And it's like, you might call it a unilateral hierarchy. So it's like God, pope, or emperor, and then everything underneath that. And there's debates over what should take the priority. Should it be the secular or the ecclesiastical authority? Starting in the high Middle Ages, that starts to get questioned. There's two famous later medieval thinkers, John of Salisbury in a work called Polycraticus, and Marsilius of Padua, who wrote Defensor Paci, or Defender of the Peace, who actually start proposing more of a, if you will, a democratic conception of authority. That is, God rules over everything, to be sure, but then he hands over the obligation to rule over the world to people who then elect officials to represent them, and so on and so forth. So then you get to Luther, and Luther in many ways kind of returns to that general medieval thinking about what's the hierarchy look like. And what's for Luther kind of interesting is he's going to say there is, God, of course, rules over everything, spiritual and physical, temporal and eternal. But then he hands down in two ways authority in the temporal realm. One, I would argue he hands down in terms of the temporal realm to, as Luther would put it, to families. That's where the onus of authority really is located when it comes to life in this world. And it's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. But if you read his large catechism, he believes fathers rule the family, and state authority, political authorities arise from that. So it's kind of a hierarchy that moves upwards towards, if that makes sense. In the right-hand kingdom, he rules through, there are offices. For him, the most important is the office of the preacher, the one who's, whether you call that a bishop or even a pope or a pastor or priest or whatever you want to call it. Though there's that office in the right-hand kingdom that is to proclaim God's word. Anything beyond that in the church, though, is actually left-hand kingdom stuff.
Yeah, which I think gets confused sometimes.
To be sure, yeah. And it's not that Luther doesn't think, I mean, Luther's not all in on this idea that the invisible church is the real deal. It is the real deal, but he believes it takes physical form in the local congregation and so on. But that local congregation, the institutional church, is still a creature of the left-hand kingdom. So Luther was asked very early on in his life, before he even becomes the reformer, before he hangs the 95 Theses on the church door in 1517, he's asked whether for his opinion by his prince, should we support the Pope's call to go on crusade? So you got a theologian being asked on whether the prince should offer troops and supplies to crusading forces against the Ottoman Turks. And Luther responds and says, heavens no. That would be a confusion of the kingdoms. But then he'll say, however, it was a Christian act of love to fight and slay the Turks wherever you can find them. And you're going, what is going on here? And with that, for Luther, he believes that wars are, regrettable, of course, and to be avoided. But if somebody is threatening your family or your neighbor, you must defend them. And that's a Christian thing to do. But it's not something that is directed towards salvation. So it's not a right-handed kingdom thing, if that makes sense. So in short, I mean, you could say, I'm probably getting very confusing here, but Luther really does, though it's different than like medieval thinkers, really does believe in a Christendom of a sort. He called it Christenheit. He believes that, for example, Saxony is a Christian principality, and that the laws of the land should reflect Christian morality, and he's going to throw in. There is no sense of like kind of a early secularism in Luther's thinking on these things, though Enlightenment thinkers certainly turned him into that. Does that all that make sense? Probably not.
I mean, somewhat, yeah. I have a couple of questions. I mean, I think just to parallel the question I asked Bruce, I want to ask what is the role of government in Luther's mind? Because I think Bruce, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said peace, to maintain peace. I hear maybe a little bit more in what you're saying, Adam, of not just peace, but human flourishing, which I think are two separate things. But you guys tell me if I'm wrong, or feel free to expound on that.
That's certainly, yeah. Luther believes in that the role of government is to restrain evil. In one place, I think it's on worldly authority, he says how foolish it would be to think that the gospel could be used to rule over the temporal left-handed kingdom. If you did that, you'd see these ravenous wolves come out. You need the law, and you need a heavy imposition, execution of the law. Otherwise, you'll see the word. It'll be Bruce referred to Thomas Hobbes earlier. It would be a war of all against all, to use Hobbesian language. So government is there to restrain evil, but also to kind of use more modern, maybe this is anachronistic, but to protect its borders. And the government is responsible for the security and the well-being of those people that live within their jurisdiction. Luther would also say the government, he's very much opposed to wars of expansion, like any sort of imperialism or anything like that. But if there's a threat, even if it is far afield, like the Ottoman Turks marching up the Danube River basin, he would highly In fact, he recommends that Germans put down what they're doing, and take up arms to resist the Ottoman Turks from taking over Christendom.
Hmm.
So security, peace, but also you use the word human flourishing. I think
And maybe
that's pretty good.
is
He
that a
believes.
is that a right? I guess maybe there's a distinction to be made. Is human flourishing the role of government and politics, or is
Mhm.
that kept, or is that more the role of the family estate?
Great question. Both, I would say. So generally,
Okay.
it would be to the family. Like, so the government is there to provide a space where families can flourish.
Okay.
There are things though that happen. A parent dies, or famine, or something like that, and Luther will support the state providing what we would today call something like welfare,
Hmm.
food, taking care of orphans and widows and things like that. So the state does play a more intrusive role when necessary. But Luther's no libertarian, but the ideal would be um, government simply is protecting and preserving the peace, and so that families could flourish. For Luther, though, ultimately he believes essential to human flourishing is the instruction and promotion of the Christian faith as a left-handed kingdom thing. The teaching of
Right.
the Christian faith. And that would
Okay.
include, as much as we might not want to talk about, that would include basic instruction in what constitutes marriage, and just things that would fall under morality for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All these debates about the third use of the law, whether Luther used the term or not, in later Luther especially, you can see him recommending all sorts of things that would fall under the third use of the law to the people that are listening to him when he's preaching and reading the things he writes.
Kelsi,
Yeah.
I would say that with Augustine, he would probably resist the word flourishing.
Okay.
I don't.
That's
I
what
don't
I
think he would
assume.
use it. Yeah, I don't think he would use it.
Yeah,
Okay.
He would push
that's a
back.
term we use
Yeah.
these days. I don't know what I'm trying to prosperity
Not really
or
a better
something.
word, though. I think it's a good
Yeah.
word. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think based on what Bruce was saying concerning Augustine, I don't know that that's on his radar at all. For Luther, it is. He believes the state is there to, again, provide the space and even aid human flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And now,
Well,
flourishing is what does that all mean?
Yeah.
Does it mean we have access to
yeah.
whatever?
Yeah.
Right.
Augustine points out, like, to this question, I would think he would say something like, well, because he says this explicitly, he goes, what's ironic is that when countries go to war, they go to war because they're both pursuing peace. And so the ideas of war and peace are so enwrapped with each other and fallen that, of course, peace is better to war, but countries justify war by seeking peace. And that is a constituent reality of living in a fallen world, that you have to go to war to get peace. And so, again, that's not a flourishing thing, though. That's the temporal good trying to work itself out, which sometimes makes things worse in an attempt to make them slightly better. But in a sense, for Augustine, war and peace aren't really that different from each other as far as the city of man is concerned.
Complicate things more. I don't know if you want me to do this because we're getting way
We
past
love
time.
complications.
But
Go on.
So in 1529, the Ottoman Turks reached Vienna, and there was a real danger. Luther believed that there would be a day where German Christians would be under Ottoman subjugation. And you would think, because he wants Christians to live in a space where they can confess the faith, sing doxologies, and live as Christians would, you'd think that he'd recommend that if you are stuck under Ottoman captivity, that you find some way back. And in a work he wrote just after the attack on Vienna, he actually, after giving advice that Christians do what they can to stop the advance of the Turks, including burning down villages, engaging in sabotage, all sorts of things. He says, but if you do end up living under the Turks, if you're sold into slavery or if you're made to be a servant in a Turkish household, consider that what God has for you now. and consider your Turkish lord, whether it's the head of that household or that estate, or even the sultan, the kind of the equivalent to the king or the emperor. You're now your new master, and serve them and serve them well, especially as you're put into service in a household. Treat that household as if it's the household that God has elected you to be a part or a member of. But like with Augustine, like Bruce said earlier, Luther does say be careful, or he cautions against doing things that might be put into service or be used to militate against the Christian faith or Christendom.
Mm.
So you can reside there. In fact, if that's where you are, that's what God has for you. And he even acknowledges that life under the Turks, though he doesn't know a whole lot about Islamic law under Turkish regime, he says you will not have access to a pastor or a preacher. You won't be able to hear the word of God from somebody else. You won't have access to books. So you need to learn the faith now so that you can do it for yourself, but do it carefully. Don't do things that are going to draw undue attention to yourself. Like don't make the sign of the cross. Come up with some other devotional type of practice. He recommends pushing your thumb against your forefinger when you say the Our Father in bed at night quietly.
Huh.
But that's what God has designed for you. And that while the Turkish regime he will argue a manifestation of demonic forces, it's also a creature of God in a way, in that it is providing a space and protecting a people so that they can live in the left-hand kingdom. And maybe like Augustine, Luther believes that wherever you might find yourself, whatever station you're in, the ultimate thing you can do is simply serve your neighbor, people around you well, so that they might look at you and your example, or perhaps even hear you in talking with you. They hear the gospel. He says, perhaps your Turkish master might be saved because on account of your good works in service to their household. So I described it as a complicated mess earlier. It's not a mess, but Luther is a very complicated person when you get down to the nitty gritty. He can't be reduced, much like Augustine, to just sort of like two kingdoms, because it's a labyrinth of ideas.
Yeah.
And it is because, like Augustine, Luther doesn't put a whole lot of stock doesn't put any stock in sort of a heaven on earth or any sort of Christian utopia. It's going to be messy. And Luther, I'm going to say more than Augustine would say, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good.
Yeah. I think I like that distinction. To me, it seems like the strength maybe of Two Kingdoms is that Luther's really focused on protecting the proclamation of the gospel,
Yeah.
and not allowing the state or the left-handed kingdom co-opt that.
Mm-hmm.
And then also not allowing, on the other side, not allowing left-hand kingdom to bleed into that thing. And I think maybe feels somewhat like Augustine, where he's trying to remind people that you're not going to be saved by government. You're not going to be saved by ruling powers. This is the only place you find salvation. So I don't know. I'm curious your thoughts. I feel like that's kind of the thing though about it. But to me, then the weakness or one of the potential weaknesses is that it could lead to a sort of quietism, which I don't know if that's how you would describe how he's laying out, like living under the Turks, the rule of the Turks. But I think that tends to be a critique, at least of, and maybe this isn't a one-to-one correlation, but of Lutherans today, where we're not willing to like engage with the political, or there's like this such a stark separation between the two that you end up not serving your neighbor in the way that you should. Would you say that that's fair?
Well, Yeah, absolutely. I know this is a controversial subject and maybe even a controversial opinion, but some have credited the quietism of otherwise really decent people in 1930s Germany
Mm.
to a false understanding of the two kingdom doctrine.
Hmm.
Um, Uwe Ziemann-Netto has a great book on that, The Fabricated Luther, that deals with that. But um, I do think this is just me, and I might be wrong, and Bruce can call me up later on and tell me I'm wrong. But I do think how you just expressed it, that this sort of quietism that keeps us from serving our neighbor because we're scared about confusing or being perceived as confusing the kingdoms or something like that, is spot on. I think of one example and point, like a real contemporary example, is in like Lutheran social services type of things in various states. Um, there are state requirements that these agencies have to fulfill to maintain certification and so on. And that includes all the gender kind of stuff, the culture kind of wars stuff. And so, um, let's say conservative confessional Lutherans or something are like, well, we're not going to play. Well, okay. I get that, wouldn't want to be a part of that. And LGBTQ kind of indoctrination and all that stuff. But who's gonna take care of those little kids or those families in need? So it's I get it, but life is messy, especially in 21st century America, especially both Luther and Augustine could not have imagined a world like ours. I mean, they could in terms of its fallenness. I mean, they're excellent interpreters of that, but they could not imagine a world where effectively every individual has been kind of elevated to the status of some sort of like political deity, where if you can get 51% of people to vote one way, that all of a sudden becomes the law of the land. They couldn't imagine populist democracy like we have in the United States or other places around the world. So we've had conversations offline about all this. It's hard. I mean, I think your point is spot on with the benefit of Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms is it helps our thinking, navigating the space and not confusing the kingdoms and not thinking that our good deeds, our pursuit of, to use Luther's language, active righteousness earns us any credit before God. It is all directed towards service of the neighbor. Simply because that's what God has called you to do while you're on your pilgrimage here on earth. But your real ultimate citizenship, and here's where Luther and Augustine would certainly agree. What really matters is your end, and your end is what is in that blessed beatific, and it's not just a vision, but place called heaven.
Yeah. Well, and I hear even maybe an agreement on that, or maybe Augustine comes in and says it in this way, that there's a limit to the good that you can do for your neighbor. That doesn't mean you don't do it, but that it's not going, because it's not ultimate. Don't put your trust in what you're able to accomplish there. I don't know. What do you think, Bruce? You've been quiet. I'm interested in your thoughts on Luther's two kingdoms.
Yeah.
He's making a list of my misspoken things.
No, not at all. I think, contra Augustine, Luther's system is far more practical as far as the everyday political decisions that people in democracies need to make. It's a much more helpful, I think, rubric to think through. Like, what should I do? Because I have these two realms that God is active in both. Where in the Augustinian tradition, that's not the case. Satan is the king or the one in charge of the kingdom of man, and God is the one in charge of the heavenly city. So you have that distinction. I think, I agree with Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, but I do sometimes get worried so there's an irony for me, a sort of contradictory irony, which is on the one hand that the doctrine of the two kingdoms does separate church and state, but the way that Luther manifests it, in my opinion, also sometimes allows the state and the church to wed in ways that I'm uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
And so you can read Luther's Two Kingdoms either way, and you can read it historically
Yeah.
either way.
Yep.
And how it's actually worked itself out in real history. So that side of it always, you can say it's a misreading. I'm fine with that too, but I think there is something intrinsic in the fact that it both separates and gives reason to join, and it just depends on how one wants to read a state doing that. And so that's the part that if I had to say a weakness, if we're doing a strengths and a weakness speech, that's what I would say.
Is it a weakness that I think you just said this, just to maybe reiterate then. The weakness is then that they are able to join, not in your mind that they're too distinct, but that they're too muddled. Is that right?
No, I don't think they're too muddled. I think Luther does a nice job of actually making them very clearly separate. But I think that because God is active in each, like there's a benefit, almost a command or an encouragement to work in both, and therefore by doing so, you can combine them, even though that's not intended, and that's the weakness I would point out. Is it's not really a weakness in the theory itself, but in how the theory can go bad
Plays
very
out.
easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can, if you think about these things super contextually, I mean, like with Luther, for example, he's working in an arena quite different than Augustine, who's at the very beginning of Christendom, where there is not a shared sort of cultural view of things,
and that Christendom might be ending.
Yeah, well, for Luther, it's like there is a Christendom, and there's differences. There's the Roman version of Christianity and so on, but there's still Christian theism is sort of the worldview that's shared. Then you try to apply it to something like America, where everybody is divinized. It can be a recipe for disaster. The debates today about concerning like Christian nationalism and things like that. And you can, Calvinists will use Calvin, and the Lutheran advocates for it will use Luther and so on. I'd be very cautious about that because it is such a very different context, and just a good old constitutional order would be nice. Returning to the sort of Calvin Coolidge's return to normalcy. I've yet to hear that from any of our political leaders.
Yeah.
Normalcy, but
that's not coming anytime soon.
I have a question because, Adam, you talked about Luther advocating for Christian morality playing out in the left-handed kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
But how does that work in a pluralistic society where
it doesn't?
You hear all the time, okay, so that's
the quick answer. Yeah.
That's the historical part that is not fair for us to replicate, copy and paste.
Yeah, and for Luther, I would say, so for Luther, Christian morality, I mean, he never used the term, he didn't have to. He assumes, and whether it's naive or not, that's a totally different discussion. He assumes that what we might call Christian morality it can also be discerned from the natural law that everybody, so
everybody knows.
Yeah, and dare I say that's a bit naive. Even back then, it was a bit naive, but certainly, I mean, we've kind of dumped the concept of natural law today. It's an old, I mean, that would burden us. We wouldn't be free to be as we want to be in the future because we'd be burdened by the past if we retain this idea of natural law. Natural law restrains you, and that's not just a modern sort of willy-nilly. It's not just modern to have rejected it, but there's a long history of distorting the concept of natural law over the course of the Enlightenment. It's freed from its Christian theological roots in the Enlightenment and turned into kind of a deist notion. And then it's finally scuttled after, say, post-Darwin and that, the era of the scientific revolution and so on. So back to your question though, Kelsi, see, I'm notorious for like going down these rabbit holes. I
It's
apologize,
fine.
but
You're good.
yeah, I don't know that it is all that helpful. I think going back to Bruce's description of Augustine, though, that's where maybe Augustine is really helpful in Christians, even though it might not make sense, pursuing what we might call Christian morality.
Well, and I think the estates and vocation are helpful in that regard because you're not calling for the implementation of Christian morality on like a high governmental level. You're saying like, hey, you're part of a Christian family, like then you pursue that. Right?
I think that is the way. We James K.A. Smith. I know Bruce is familiar with a lot of his stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Refers to Christian communities, the Christian church, as sort of an alternate politic, I think is what he calls it. That is, we live in a pluralistic society, you just live in a Christian way, and that's the best thing you can hope for. And in doing that, though, you'll look so different than the rest of the world that perhaps it'll be, people look at it and say, oh, that's sort of what I want. But the one thing I'm a little concerned about is it seems that we are moving in the direction as an American culture such that if you pursue your morality and you don't embrace the other and say, oh, that's as good too, that's starting to be seen as hateful or hate speech. If you're just saying marriage is between a man and a woman, right? And this is what we teach, because you have this exclusive understanding of it, or I guess that's the right way of putting it. You're necessarily marginalizing or discounting or guilty of hating the other. And I think you're starting to see that a little bit. Not like from the top down, but in our culture. If you don't embrace all this other stuff, if you're not, it's not enough just to be sort of quiet about it. You've got to include it.
Smith would say, and he's coming out of an Augustinian tradition with this, actually, that, and he's written quite a bit about this. Is kind of his thing now, is this idea of formation. That because Augustine points out in the two cities, the cities are really at the most fundamental level. What distinguishes the two cities is what they love. So the city of God desires God and God's will, and the city of man desires its own will, which is what Satan does. It's the pride that drives that. And so Smith points out in the Augustinian tradition that what this functionally means is that both cities are worshiping all the time. They're actually engaged in worship. And so there's this undertone of spiritual warfare that's going on in the two cities as well. And so like when Adam's saying what I'll call like a recognition, right? Like, so it's not enough that I believe something. It's enough that you have to recognize my belief as equal or greater than yours.
Right.
And Smith would, I think, using the Augustinian tradition, say, well, yeah, that's because both cities are operating each and every day with a vision of the good life. And the good life is the thing that you love and that you are pursuing and that you can justify your moral behavior to get to. It sets your ethics up. But then Smith would go further and he would say, but what Augustine teaches us is that you are what you love, and therefore the cities are actually engaged in two things. They're engaged on the one hand in this presentation of the good life, but on the other hand, they are forming you into the images of themselves, because in the Augustinian tradition, you are what you love. So the thing that you attach your love to is the thing you become, because in the Augustinian tradition, we are passive to love. That's what it means to be a creature. Love pulls us towards itself. So if we love things that we should not, or we love them wrongly, like in and of themselves, instead of loving them for God's sake, that's what sin is. So sin is the love of things inappropriately. But we can't not love, and so therefore we can't not worship. And so the Augustinian tradition would say these battles that are taking place on the political level aren't really ideology. That's just the surface. That's where the arguments are taking place, but they're actually caught up deeply in the heart and what people love and the type of thing they want to see, and that all comes down to what they're worshiping. And so,
that's. I mean, we've talked about. Does he go by Jamie Smith? Before?
Yeah, he goes by Jamie.
And I've got my only reservation was his stuff is on his comments on apologetics, but I think he's
he does have a lot about that.
I don't know if he's spot on.
Presuppositionalist. He's a little bit of a presuppositionalist, right?
Yeah. And but I don't want to take you down this rabbit hole because it's one of my hobby horses, so it'll be
okay.
But I think all other things, Jamie Smith is onto something really important. And here is maybe why Augustine is a little more relevant than Luther.
Yeah, that book where he parses that out, it's a three book series, but the one you really need to read is Desiring the Kingdom, if you're interested in that topic.
Yeah.
How the Augustinian tradition speaks into modern formation.
That's great. Well, I don't know if this is going to be 2 parts or what we're going to do with this, but
it should be 2 parts.
To wrap up, is it worth maybe providing 1 or 2 takeaways that you think Augustine and Luther would have for American Christians in 2024 when it comes to politics?
Well, I would say the first thing it comes right to mind that Augustine would say is beware of civic religion. You are what you love. So if you fall in love with a politician and a party and a platform, you're already in danger. Because if you're hoping that thing is going to somehow change the world for the better, Augustine would be very skeptical of that. If you're able to say this politician, this party, or this platform will do the most good comparative to the good that could be maximized, whatever that is, relative to other nation states, then he would say, then that's how you should vote. But as soon as you take it a step further and be like, this party, person, or platform is our salvation in some way, Augustine's going to be like, oh, you're loving something too much. You're loving something too much.
Yeah.
You're clearly speaking about the affection people have for Vermin Supreme, right?
I have not heard his name in quite a while. Is he even still alive?
I think so. I don't know
still
if he's
wearing like a boot.
Around. Well, last I saw, I don't know. Are you from the Vermin Supreme, Kelsi?
I have no idea who y'all are talking about.
He's from New England somewhere, and he promised everybody a pony. But
for Luther, the rent is too damn high, guy.
Oh yeah, yes. For Luther, Kelsi, I think the takeaway is it's just sort of classic Luther. Your righteousness has been won for you on the cross of Christ and given to you, despite yourself, in terms of your standing before God. So now you are free, and free from fear of even failing, which you will, in serving your neighbor well and doing what's good in your community for your family and by extension the rest of those around you. And in terms of like national politics, what Bruce just said, I think Luther could say that too.
Yeah.
Be very wary of that confusion of the kingdom where all of a sudden the state becomes the mouthpiece of the gospel, the good news.
Yes.
And also be very wary of the state that would be, I think, certainly Augustine, but also Luther, very wary of this, that the state is, while it can do good in very temporal relative ways, that it too, it serves a master, and that master ain't God.
Yeah.
Be wary of that as well. So.
That's great. Well, thank you guys so much. Thanks for talking, y'all. Outside Ourselves is a 1517 podcast and show. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcast. If you liked this conversation, I would love if you could give the show a 5-star review, maybe even a short written review on Apple Podcasts. That's really a great place to leave us a review. Those help get more eyes on the show. A reminder, too, that the show can be found on YouTube, where you can not only listen but watch. You can find the link to that in the show notes. Make sure you subscribe to the Kelsi Quimberry channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. Thanks as always for listening. I'll be back here in a couple weeks with our next guest.